I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this inaugural event of the Meghalaya State Capability Forum. This forum is for discussion about the most important challenges and opportunities facing the state. As a state, we aspire to a vibrant and resilient economy to promote health and well-being of every person, to generate sustainable livelihoods that protect our environment while also increasing the welfare of our people, to build an education system that prepares our students for full and productive lives. These aspirations are important and urgent. As the state leadership, it is imperative that we deliver on these needs in a timely way. The challenges we may face may seem daunting, but we can cause for hope. Each challenge we solve builds our capability to solve more challenges. We have been using this principle of building our capability to address maternal and child mortality, nutrition, by mobilizing people across the multiple departments and at all levels, as well as the community leadership, to develop tailored solutions enabling people to access care. We have also mobilized the state and local community leadership to increase access and utilization of employment guarantee program and community development. These initiatives have yielded important quick wins, and they are building our state capability to identify and solve problems, adapt solutions, mobilize stakeholders, and collaborate across different groups. This increases our capability to tackle the next challenge and the next challenge. We should think of building state capability as people of Meghalaya have thought of building the root bridges, just the way we are building something that will endure and grow stronger over time so that it can carry more and more weight. In this way, solving challenges makes our state more capable, it meets urgent needs, and it builds public confidence in the state. This public confidence, as well as all seen, is essential for enabling the state to succeed in everything from combating COVID to climate change. So we recognize that solutions for these complex challenges not easy. They require the courage to experiment. They require dedication to learn from both successes and failures, and they require leadership that provides a holding environment. So we are, really especially grateful for the leadership of our Honorable Chief Minister, P. Konrad Shangma, in supporting new initiatives and address complex challenges in the state. He has provided great exemplary leadership by focusing on issues of critical importance and has created an environment which I call holding environment, in which new ideas and innovations can be launched. Alongside the Chief Minister, I would like to appreciate the leadership of the Honorable Cabinet Ministers and the Chief Secretary, who are very important in this process of building the state capability. So finally, I also would like to thank the CPR, Center for Policy Research in Delhi, who are partnering with the Government of Meghalaya to host this State Capability Forum. So CPR is a leading think tank of India, conducting research and contributing to generating new ideas and hosting robust public debate about the structures and processes that shape contemporary life in India today. I would like to invite Yamini Iyer, the president of CPR, basically to say a few words about the forum. So Yamini, over to you.
Honorable Chief Minister, Shri Sampath Kumarji, Lant, Meghla, friends, on behalf of the Center for Policy Research, it's an absolute privilege for me to be part of this discussion and for the Center to be a partner with the State Capability Initiative at Meghalaya. This is perhaps one of the first states that have actively taken on the mantle of addressing this extremely critical but foundational foundational issue that confronts India today. We face significant 21st century challenges. Each of these challenges requires the Indian state to be more agile, more adaptive, more innovative. And in order to be able to be agile, adaptive, and innovative, we need to have a serious discourse about what will it take to strengthen the foundations of the state so that it can fulfill the aspirations of people. It's a real privilege and pleasure for us to be part of this thinking and dialogue with the state, and I hope that we can make a robust contribution. So thank you very much for giving us the opportunity. CPR has been part of a large number of activities in Meghalaya, including working on health and with the public finance management work. Sir, you may recall you'd also graced us in early March for a discussion on fiscal federalism. We've really valued our engagement with the state. It's been an important learning ground for us and an important opportunity for us to both strengthen our own understandings as well as hopefully contribute to the big challenges of building the Indian state's capability for the 21st century. So thank you, and looking forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you, Yamini. Now I would like to introduce our speaker for the inaugural event of this forum, Professor Lant Pritchett. Lant Pritchett is a development economist from US. After getting his PhD in economics from MIT, Lant worked at the World Bank for almost 2 decades, during which he spent a lot of time in India and Indonesia. He then taught at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where he was the faculty chair for MPA International Development Program. He is currently the research director at RISE, Research on Improving Systems of Education program at Oxford University. He has worked and researched extensively in the fields of economic growth, state capability, education, and labor mobility. He also co-authored the problem-driven iterative adaptation approach, the PDII, which is known a lot to, in fact, in Meghalaya, especially to the deputy commissioners and the district collectors, which we have used in different sectors, including COVID pandemic management. So now I request Lant Pritchett to present.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I feel very honored to be the first speaker in this State Capability Forum, and hope this kicks off a long and productive set of discussions that can create a consensus about the directions that the state can move in order to enhance capability. In the introduction, you said I'm from the United States, but the bio points out I'm from Idaho, which is a very small and remote state of the United States. So some affinity for small and remote states as opposed to the big centers that are often easier to work in. So I'm going to share my screen, and as a, I guess, typical academic, I'd like to keep it to just maybe 20 minutes to provide a kind of overarching overview to some issues around state capability that I think will be important for discussions as you move forward. So I'm going to share my screen. So I want to talk about state capability, and I want to talk about some do's and some don'ts and some do's and do nots of donuts. And hope if we were in the post-COVID era, I would come in person and bring some donuts just to add some concreteness to the metaphor and some sweetness to the presentation. Unfortunately, the donuts are only metaphorical at this stage. So I want to really just lay out 3 kind of big issues. The first is the do, a do not, and then what are donuts and how do we think about the do's and do nots of donuts. So the first do is we really should pay attention to state capability as it's central to achieving higher levels of human well-being. And oftentimes I want to contrast what I'm saying with what I call the received wisdom. And I think part of the received wisdom has paid way too much attention to what should be done or which policy should be adopted or how a policy should be designed, and way too little attention to the underlying capability to implement policy. And so my first argument, and I'm an argumentative guy, if not an argumentative Indian, my first point is that we should pay more attention to the capability of what we can do and a little less attention to imagining that we can begin on program design on the assumption we can do whatever we want and implement it effectively, because that leads us often to mistakes, which leads to the do not. The do not is do not seek to adopt best practice, as best practice often isn't just a neutral thing, but it actually destroys state capability. And I want to talk a little bit about how the seemingly innocuous and ambitious thing of adopting best practice can actually undermine the path to state capability rather than reinforce it. And then I want to talk about donuts. And what I mean by a donut is a state organization that has lost its core. So as we know, a donut is something with a hole in the middle. And I often worry that the real challenge facing the building of state capability is that the existing organizations have become donuts. They've actually lost their core of a purpose and a set of technical practices that achieve those purpose. And in an organization without a core, really fundamentally can't do things. And the first do not of donuts is you can't fix a donut organization by outside-in reform. You can't fix it by beating it from the outside. You can't fix it by, greater accountability. You have to fix a donut from the inside out. You have to recreate the purpose. You have to reestablish a purpose. And then second, what I do about donuts is a PDIA approach. A PDIA approach is a way of starting with an organization that may have wandered into being a shell organization and lost purpose. And by rebuilding a core purpose around a priority problem that's within reach of the organization, you can kind of reinitiate or reboot the organization towards capability. So let me first talk about do focus on building state capability. And by state capability, I mean organizational capability of the organizations in the state is the ability for the agents, the frontline agents up and down, and those up and down the chain of the organization to take the actions that promote the objectives. Unless your organization has the capability to induce teachers to show up and teach effectively, induce nurses to show up and respond to patients effectively, induce the police to respond appropriately to disorder and crime, without that underlying capability, it kind of doesn't matter what policies you adopt. And moreover, whereas a huge amount of the development focus has been on policies, should we adopt this policy or this program design or that program design, when you look in the big picture, what matters for human well-being is level of income, which matters in a whole variety of ways, both through private efforts and through creating a tax base on which governments can do stuff, and state capability, and almost nothing else. So it may well not really matter that much what policies one are formally adopted or legally adopted. If you don't have capability, it just doesn't matter. So a lot of times the program design question is the question of whether I should wear a red t-shirt or a green t-shirt in running a 4-minute mile. Well, I'm old and fat. I can't run a 4-minute mile. I can't run a 10-minute mile. So too much debate about what t-shirt I wear as I run is really kind of not to the point. The point is, if I need to run, I need to work on the running capability, not the program design. So let me just show this graph, which is something I'm working on, and it takes an index of well-being that have been created that are the basics: nutrition, basic healthcare, basic education, access to electricity, water, and sanitation. So I take an index of how well are the populations of these various countries around the world met in their ability to achieve the basics. And then I look at the relationship statistically between GDP per capita and state capability. And what I find is that both of those things matter a lot. And in such that, if we imagine increasing capability on this index that runs from a 1 to 100 by 25 points, which is roughly kind of a standard deviation of the distribution across countries, that would actually increase this index of well-being by about 8 points. To increase well-being by about 8 points through economic growth would take 17 years of economic growth at 3% per capita. So economic growth is a powerful underlying causal factor that tends to raise the level of well-being. But at any given level of well-being also gets is also better when state capability was improved. So the path to human well-being and prosperity runs both through creating a productive economy, which provides a basis for private incomes and for a tax revenue base that provides the government the needed resources it needs to carry out core functions, but it also runs through having, independently of that, and on top of that, having capability. And kind of more so, I think, again, we want to get the causal chain right. One thing capable states do is they adopt effective programs, but not vice versa. You can't just adopt an effective program independently of having the capability to implement it. So I just give one example because it's kind of fun and kind of instructive, which is around the world, all countries have exactly the same policy about some things, and yet the range of performance ranges the entire possible range. So for instance, this is a study of delivering the mail. All countries are signatories to a convention that specifies how they'll handle misaddressed mail that arrives from another country, and says that they'll return misaddressed mail to the sending country within 30 days. So all countries have exactly the same policy, but the range of outcomes of whether they implement that policy ranges from 0 to 100%. So if you mail, and these clever and slightly mischievous researchers mailed misaddressed mail to various countries to see how long it takes to come back, and in a quarter of the countries, or the lowest 25 of countries, none of them 10 misaddressed letters ever came back, whereas countries like Finland and Uruguay and Paraguay, Colombia, Czech Republic, all of the letters came back. But this is just a point that there's a huge discrepancy between what countries say they're going to do, what their official de jure legal policies are, and what they actually do. So many countries say exactly the same thing. So every country has formal policies that committed to achieving universal literacy and numeracy, but outcomes of whether kids learn in primary school basically range from 0 to 100. In some countries of the world, finishing grade 6, almost 0% of the kids who finish primary school can read, and in other countries, 100% of the kids can read. So it isn't the policies that determine outcomes, it's the capability that determines outcomes. Same for health, same for corruption. Corruption, as we know, is a problem all around the world. No country has laws to enable or promote corruption, and yet some countries have massive corruption, some countries it exists, but it's mostly a minor nuisance. And all of that is capability to implement what you have, not that different countries have radical different formal legal policies. So the first do is, and this is, I think, an important thing to say at the initiation of a state capability forum, focusing on state capability is in fact a reliable path to higher well-being across basically everything you can think of gets better if you have a more capable state, because it can participate in a variety of ways with the society and with the economy to increase well-being. And the converse is to a large extent true. If you don't have capability, there's very little it doesn't matter what you say, it doesn't matter what policy you adopt, it doesn't matter in some sense what what the legislature adopts. If you can't do it, you can't do it. And so saying you're going to do it, actually, and this is my second point, do not seek to adopt best practice. Saying you're going to do things that you can't do actually hurts. So I want to sort of give an analogy of an army. And when you think of the capability of an army, there's two kinds of elements. One is what the army can look like on the parade ground, or what they can do when they're not under pressure, how many times they can fire the cannon per minute, or how fast the planes, or how accurately they can shoot when they're not under stress. But the whole point of an army is that when you need it, it's going to be under stress. Some opposing army is going to be fighting against them. And you want to think about, how does the capability of the army deteriorate when it's under more pressure? So there's the robustness of the capability. And basically, if you throw a low capability army against a high capability army, the low capability army just collapses. It loses its organizational integrity, and hence its capability to perform falls to 0. So there's often a sharply linear dynamic of organizations. So, throwing your army against a force that is superior to it can turn your army into basically a disorganized mob, in which case you've destroyed what capability you had by asking it to do too much too soon. So there's two completely different views of how one improves the capability of the state to adopt effective practices. One is this kind of notion that you big jump in policy. We adopt this ambitious policy, and then somehow the pull of this ambitious policy will improve practices towards the policy. The other view is that the way you improve practice is by improving practice. And you take the hard slog of improving within the organization the practices, and ultimately good policies reflect good practices. And these are two entirely, you can see, different causal notions. And the risk of best practice is that if the best practice is far from the current achievable practice, you're going to force your organizations into administrative fiction. And once you force your organizations into administrative fiction, it becomes even harder to undertake the hard slog reform that actually improve practice. There's a number of examples of that, meaning one of the things organizations do is they have to decide what the facts are. A policy is, you should do this if this is the fact. If I'm a tax collector and I'm collecting property taxes, this is the value of the property, and if this is the value of the property, and that's the administrative fact, then I collect this much tax revenue. The difficulty is the facts are actually pretty flexible. And if I put too much pressure, I've got pressures on the organization to be accurate in the facts, but I've got pressures to create fictions. I've got pressures to under-declare the property value. I've got pressures to declare that I was, in fact, present when I wasn't. I have pressures to declare things that aren't true as the administrative fact. And what that happens is then you create a common fiction about what's actually going on. So a study that's part of this larger RISE project that I was just doing actually measured, they redid the official test of mathematics in Madhya Pradesh under their own controlled conditions that sort of guaranteed accuracy. And what they found is that if you look at the official results are about twice as optimistic of what students can do in school as the true results. So basically, the officially reported test scores, even in a low-stakes environment, even on a test that in Madhya Pradesh is not really meant to be high stakes for teachers, not meant to be high stakes for schools, even on a low-stakes assessment, just massive undermining of the facts. So if you believe the facts, you would believe that on average, the proportion correct on mathematics in the schools was, kind of those blue dots or the official was between 60 and 80%. Kids are able to answer about 60 to 80% of the questions correctly. The reality is they can answer 20 to 40% of the questions correctly. Now, if you start off making policy on the presumption that 60 to 80% of the kids are getting the test correctly, what do we do now? You're going to get completely misguided as to what you actually should be doing when the actual facts are that 20 to 40% of the questions are answered correctly by kids. And so I just want to give this example of a randomized controlled trial of the popular type that was done in Rajasthan some years back. It mainly illustrates the point of the danger of kind of adopting best practice. So the a Rajasthan-based NGO, Sewa Mandir, together with some brilliant Nobel Prize-winning academics, designed a way to improve the attendance of auxiliary nurse midwives at the health subcenters. Because they had noted the blue line that only about 45%, in the baseline survey, only about 45% of the nurses were present at their duty station when they should have been. So they designed this wonderful policy that was going to have performance pay for nurses. They would only get paid their full salary if they were present at least half the time. They had NGO involvement in ground truthing. They improved the kind of time recording system so that it was, machine-based and not paper-based. They did everything you would have think of to do because, of course, they were geniuses. What happened was that the recorded absence, according to the official administrative records, went way down. So absent or on casual leave fell from 25% to only 9%. So on one level, this program is a big success. What actually happened was that the fraction of nurses that were physically present in the clinic, such that if you showed up needing something, someone would be there to help you, that went way down too. So that fell from 45% to 30%. So the actual presence at clinics got much worse. And you might think, well, wait a second, either they're present or they're absent, but I'm sure no one who worked with the Indian bureaucracy would believe that it was so easy as you're either present or you're absent. There was a third category called exempt from duty. What happened is when you put pressure on the system, people just reallocated casual leave or just not showing up for being exempted from duty, so it didn't count against them towards the performance pay. So the fraction of time of nurses that was exempt from needing to be present at the duty station went from a little more than 10% to over 50%. So by putting pressure on the system to improve attendance, you made attendance much worse. And worse than that, you created this enormous fiction, because now the administrative records show that absence isn't a problem. Absence is only 9%. Why would we worry about absence? So that's the second main point I want to make is all your efforts to, I think the way to build state capability is start from the capability you have and build up. Build towards greater capability rather than imagine you're going to start from a sort of overarching policy and some wonderful practice, some wonderful program design, and then be able to implement that, because the failed attempt to implement best practice makes things worse. It's not just that they fail and it's the same, you can actually make things worse. So let me talk briefly about the do's and do nots of donuts. I want to stick to roughly 20 minutes. Effective organizations are effective, in my view, from a core out. And the core of an effective organization is an overriding and reasonably shared purpose. People in an effective organization know what the organizations are about and share in the vision of that effective organization. And then they share a vision of what the technical practices that lead to the accomplishment of that purpose are. And that is the core of a religious organization. It's the core of a state organization. It's the core of a private sector organization. It's the core of a successful university. It's just a characteristic, I think, of successful organizations. And then around the core, you build a whole array of support functions. You build procurement. The organization needs to buy stuff, so it needs procurement. You build some human resources policies. The organization needs to hire people. It needs a human resources department. It needs some accounting, so you hire some accountant and some financial practices of how money will be, accounting. You need some IT. You need some data that tracks what the organization's doing. You need a legal team to prevent the organization from getting in trouble. But all of these are peripheral functions around the core. Now, organizations can lose their technical core and become donuts. One is that you lose a sense of purpose. For a variety of reasons, conflict among various shareholders of what the true purpose is can lead the organization to lose a sense of purpose, or you can lose commitment to a set of effective practices. The world can change in such a way that what you were doing is no longer effective, or you can change in a way, or maybe you were never doing anything that was effective. Now, once an organization has lost its core, that core is often filled by a parasite or a virus. It's filled by something. The organization, particularly if it's a state organization, doesn't just stop existing. It continues to kind of survive, but it survives as a shell of itself, or as a zombie. It continues to survive, but it isn't, and it might actually look like the organization used to look, but it's no longer really a viable organization. Now, the do not about donuts is the technical fixes from the outside, or the drive of organizations to compliance. So, you can try and drive an outside organization through a data-enabled accountability, or through, we're going to get tough on procurement. But I think my first kind of pithy metaphor is you can't beat a turtle to move. If you're confronting a dysfunctional state organization, you're likely confronting a dysfunctional state organization that has survived in this dysfunctional state for years or decades. And it has survived because it has a pretty hard and robust exterior shell to outside attack. And what happens if you beat a turtle? The turtle pulls in its arms, its legs, its heads. You beat on it for a while till you get tired, till politics moves on, till the IAS officer gets transferred. And then the organization goes about in exactly the dysfunctional way that it was going about before. So, you can't beat a turtle to move. You need the inside of the turtle, the head of the turtle, the legs of the turtle to pull out and head the direction you want it to head. So, if we're thinking about improving state capability, we have to think of how do we improve state capability from the inside out. Now, the second pithy metaphor is that you don't make Pinocchio from a puppet into a real boy by adding more strings. And I hope this metaphor isn't lost on what exactly I'm talking about, but there's a tendency to believe that if we just had enough IT, if we just, put a tracking device in every civil servant's arm, we could somehow command and control the state into greater effectiveness. And it doesn't work like that. If you want a real boy, from a puppet, you need magic. You need something to happen to transform it in such a way that it has an internal drive and an internal practice. So the do of donuts is PDIA, and PDIA is already being practiced, I know, in some units of Meghalaya and other places, but it's local solutions for local problems. You need to start from a problem. You need to reorient the organization to a problem-solving mentality where you generate an authorizing environment to work a problem. Then once you have a problem, you need to push problem-driven positive deviance. You need to allow people to do something different than what they're doing in order that they can discover what works. And that requires freeing people up to search for solutions to the problem. That search is going to involve try, learning, iterating, and adapting. That is the IA of PDIA. And that means you need feedback loops. You need to say, I'm going to try this. How am I going to know if it's going to work? What are going to be the signals that tell me whether or not it's working? And then finally, you're going to scale this through the organization through diffusion. Diffusion means other people adopt these improved practices because they're convinced they're improved practices that will make them better off. That's how you're going to scale learning. It's not going to be scaled in a top-down way. Although the top can facilitate the scaling, it still has to diffuse. So I'm going to stop there, and I know people will have questions and we have time for discussion. So let me just reiterate. First, the focus on state capability is central. The focus on policy and program design, I think, is entirely secondary to, it's fun to do, it's easy to do, but it's entirely secondary to, what is it that these organizations can actually do that will actually have traction on real world problems that affect the citizens of the state? And that's going to be building capability, not adopting new policies necessarily. And moreover, the policies that are effective are likely to emerge from effective practices rather than being parachuted in And that's the second thing is best practice is not only is it not best practice, it's not even good practice, probably bad practice to adopt best practice. The achievable practices should be the goal, and the goal of capability efforts is to expand the range of achievable and effective practices. If that starts out as the goal, you will work your way to the achievable practices. And then finally, we should all admit in discussions of state capability that we are where we are. And that sounds stupid, I know, but we are in the historical trajectory of state capability that we're in, which means many of the organizations we want to work to improve have been managed to maintain their current low capability, their current practices for years, if not decades, at this low-level equilibrium trap that they're in. And so we shouldn't expect fixes to be easy or instantaneous. Fixing a donut is hard, and we're going to waste our time and effort if we're focused on outside-in fixes. A donut needs to be fixed by filling the center towards the edges, not fixed from procurement reform or accounting reform or IT-enabled data structures, creating the core. The core has to reach out to the services, not vice versa. And then finally, the strategies that are going to rebuild a purpose and effectiveness in a donut environment are basically problem-driven approaches. They're going to get the individual agents and authorizers of the organizations excited and motivated by solving a problem, and then move towards practices that solve the problem as a way of reinvigorating the core. Let me stop there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Professor. This is great. I think you gave great insights on do's, do nots, do's and do nots of donuts. I think the example of a donut actually is very, very important for us. So, in fact, before I request the participant, especially a lot of colleagues are there from those who are working with the Meghalaya, and also the deputy commissioners who are the district magistrates. They're also here. And before actually I open the forum, I would like to start with begin with a question on education, because you have done a lot of research on education. You also wrote about schooling is not learning. So can you tell us a bit about what you mean when you say that schooling is not learning, and how can this education story inform how we think about state capability?
I think the education story is in many ways illustrative and even paradigmatic of the challenge of state capability, which is when countries post-independence began to expand their education system, in some sense, the purpose was very clear. The purpose was to equip children for their adult lives, to equip them with the skills they needed, literacy, numeracy, knowledge, critical skills, etc., in order to, be effective citizens, effective workers, effective members of the community, effective parents, all the things you need to do as an adult. Over time, that involved both getting every kid in school and making sure the kids in school learn. The difficulty is one of those tasks was really amenable to the logistic kinds of ways in which governments like to operate, hierarchical process compliance. So you can build schools in a process compliance way. So what not just India, many countries around the world did is they were quite amazingly successful at expanding the enrollments of children in school. The problem is that that modality of running an organization often eroded the core commitment to the actual purpose of education. So you had a lot of education systems that more and more were just going through the motions of schooling without actually producing real effective learning environments inside the schools. And so you've got what a recent RISE paper has called an anti-work culture, where the people, given that there wasn't a clear and driving purpose, and that they didn't see that clear and driving purpose of educating children as actually being rewarded or promoted by the system, you got an environment of cynicism, you got an environment of absenteeism, you got an environment of indifference to actual learning. And so you ended up with schooling and not learning. And again, I'm not talking specifically about India. This is a generic phenomenon in many countries around the world. So essentially what you now have are semi-zombie education systems. The education system isn't, in fact, an integrated system committed to a set of effective practices to promote learning and a shared understanding of the learning that's being promoted. So now you need to reinvigorate the purpose of learning. If you don't start from a reinvigoration of the purpose of learning, none of the education reforms that are piecemeal or outside driven can really make a difference. And, you know, I think I was living in India when, you know, the SSA program was, you know, being implemented at scale, and it just never really readdressed the core problem. And hence you had massive expansions of expenditure, massive improvements in what I call the thin inputs. You know, more schools had a boundary wall, more schools had toilets for boys and girls, and all of those things were nice, but the underlying core never got touched, and hence we just haven't yet seen significant improvements in learning. So I think this illustrates exactly the tension between kind of a process compliance mode in which state organizations can survive and a purpose-driven mode in which state organizations can thrive and expand their capability.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I will just before requesting my colleague, Dr. Vijay, just one question again to everyone. Often people think that state capability means training. You know, is training the same as the state capability building? We would like to get your insights on this.
The answer is no. No. The answer is not no. The answer is no. It's really no. And let me start from a slightly cynical statement that a friend of mine, who's one of my development heroes, makes, which is, there's the old saying, if you teach a man to fish, you feed him for one day. The corollary is, if you set up a training program to teach a man to, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for one day. But if you set up a training program to teach a man to fish, you can give your brother-in-law the contract. Training is on the assumption that the core limiting factor of the organization's capability are individual capacities that can be transmitted through training. So often training focuses on the capacity of the individual, not the capability of the organization. And what we can see is in dysfunctional organizations, or individuals aren't getting to anywhere near their actual already existing capacities. There's a really excellent study done by Jishnu Das and Kartik Muralidharan about healthcare practices in India, and I think it is in rural Madhya Pradesh that they did the study. And they basically looked at what public sector MBBS doctors did in their public sector practices, and they measured their theoretical knowledge, and then they measured what those exact same doctors did in their private sector practices. And what they found is, in their public sector practices, the doctors were just doing incredibly less than what they knew to do and what they in fact did when they were in their private practices. So in that context, training, okay, we can train the MBBS doctors to have more medical knowledge, but their capacity as doctors was never, ever, ever the issue for the capability of the healthcare they were providing. So in our work, we make a big difference between an organization and its capabilities, which is what can it induce the agents to do in practice, and the capacities of individuals. So just around the world, just billions and billions and billions of dollars spent on training. But if that training is individual capacity focused in a way that isn't focused on what are the actual binding constraints, what's holding an organization back from being more capable at achieving its purposes, if the training isn't geared towards building organizational capability, it's a complete and total waste of time and money. So there is training that can work. but the training has to be focused on a problem-driven, purpose-driven building of organizational capability, not a technically driven building of individual capacities. I mean, property, just take tax collection, right? The problem isn't valuing property. Property tax is not under-collected because the incapacity to value property is somehow in short supply. It's something they could do. They just don't. And so you'd have to say, why are we organized such that they're not exercising even the capabilities they have? So I think I'm, training can work, and it mostly doesn't. And it mostly doesn't because it's based on a wrong theory of what the limitations are to organizational capability.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to request our Chief Secretary, ma'am, would like to make some questions.
It's not an observation, it's just a question. We in government are great at enunciating policies, but our Achilles heel is, implementation, delivery. So what's happening right now is a top-down approach. Okay, we may, put up a policy in the public domain and ask the suggestions from the public, but most often than not, we tend to even ignore those suggestions. So a better thing would have been a bottoms-up approach, but knowing the capability or rather incapability of our local functionaries, how do we do this? How do we come up with a bottoms-up approach for a policy?
I think the answer is a bottom-up approach needs to be selective in the sense that, nobody imagines that, or I hope nobody imagines, that we have this kind of slightly dysfunctional top-down approach, and the answer is to just let everything happen. Just let's release all of the top-down constraints, and somehow things will get better. That's not what's going to happen, right? So what I think you want to think of is in nearly every organization, there's going to be three kinds of people. There's going to be people who are basically willing to free ride on the organization, rent seek on the organization, be corrupt. They're not really either concerned with following the rules or with organizational purpose. Then there's a group that are willing to do kind of whatever they're told to do. Well, these are process compliers. And then in every organization and there's going to be some more people who want to do better, who are in the organization for the purpose, who have ideas. And the key to a successful bottom-up approach, and this is an integral part of PDIA, is to create an environment in which you can unleash the potential capabilities of those people. So it isn't an immediate organization reform in which we immediately devolve all power and decision-making to the bottom up. Rather, what it is how do we unleash within the capabilities within the organization such that we enable them to go beyond process compliance to purpose-driven problem solving. So we enable that. And then what we hope happens is they start discovering, and we do it, by the way, without enabling them with tons more money or tons more resources, because that is just going to make what they do not replicable elsewhere. But we unleash them to, do new and innovative things. Then, hopefully, with feedback loops, we find that they get more effective at solving problems. Then what we try and do is use those practices to bring the next group along, right? So I'm not saying that every individual person inside these organizations or inside is going to be an innovator. But what we can do is if we can unleash the innovators, then the innovators can drag the compliers to better practices. And then we worry about the non-compliers later. But the opposite, and this is what I characterize as the outside-in approach, is that we treat everybody as a process, as one of two things. One, we treat everybody as a process complier, and we don't provide the innovators with space, right? So again, this isn't, bottom-up is a tactical and strategic bottom-up, not an immediate agenda in which we just turn loose everybody to do whatever they want. So that we need to recreate a balance in which we can create some pressure from the local initiatives, and then use that pressure from the local initiatives to lead the turtle, which is the potential process compliers, into better performance. So it's a selective and tactical bottom-up rather than I worry that a lot of the bottom-up, one response I often make to sort of bottom-up is, I can see that this is the bottom, I don't see any up. What's your strategy for getting from the bottom that you're in now up? And so I take PDIA as a strategy for unleashing the capabilities that do exist within the organization and the purpose-driven individuals in the organization to innovate in a way that creates potentially replicable practices that can draw the organization up and draw other localities up. But that's what I mean by diffusion rather than top-down.
Thank you. This is great. Vijay?
Good evening, Professor. Very quickly, this tension between the purpose and the process is something that we kind of deal with every day. And as you said, I think in the organization, there's a big chunk of process compliers, and there is very little space for the people who are purpose driven. So the central question then is, how do we create purposeful organizations? To me, I see only two ways. One is, okay, in developed countries, in the Western countries, there is a huge cultural influence in the sense that it is hundreds of years of good practices in the society which have built up to kind of create those organizations. That's one. Second is leadership. Is there, of course, I'm sure, in the PDIA, there are, ways of how to do this. But when I think about these two things, and neither of these two is in the control of, they're both random in the sense that, okay, culture, whether you have this cultural thing or not. Leaders is, okay, you get these good leaders or not, because this is not. So how do you systematically create purpose-driven, especially in government? Because the tension in government, why people are process-driven is because, especially if you think from a spending money point of view, people are spending public money and there are hundreds of rules and regulations. And so where is that fine balance and who is to determine that balance? And that's the reason why, the government machineries are slow and we measure people on processes because that is easy to measure.
I think you're exactly right that within the public sector, there's this there's sacred trust of the public weal, right? We've taken money away from people through taxes and hence we need to be responsible in spending it, right? And so one of the things I hear all the time is that public sector organizations are hard to reform because they're afraid of failure. And I think, like many things that are the conventional wisdom, this is exactly wrong. Public sector organizations exist to fail without blame. It's not that they're failing. I mean, after all, the education system is not afraid of failing to teach kids to read. They are not teaching kids to read. And yet that failure has no traction. Like nobody is afraid of that failure. I remember one time I was working with an Indian colleague of mine and I was proposing that we unleash some bottom-up pressure of some local level village school committees to try new practices around education. And their response was, no, that would be too risky. Allowing, people any latitude would be too risky because they might misuse or abuse the money. And this was in a state where 11% of kids could read at a grade 2 level in grade 4. And so I said, whoa. So you're saying it's too risky. What about the risk that 89% of kids are not learning to read at grade level? Like that risk you're apparently willing to ignore. You're not afraid of that failure. You're just afraid of blame, right? So one way I think of what needs to happen in order to build state capability is we have to move from a set of systems that allow failure without blame to a set of systems that allow success without blame. And that might sound paradoxical of allowing success without blame, But that's really a huge risk. Oftentimes the people who are pushing at the borders of doing things that would actually enable success are then highlighted for not, being process compliant, for being sort of not following the rules. And so success actually brings blame, whereas failure at a core purpose doesn't bring blame. So second, now let me get to your two approaches. One is that there's a Chinese leader, and I forget who it was, I think it was Deng Xiaoping, who used to say, whenever I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun. In the sense that culture is often kind of this vague, amorphous thing that kind of blocks progress, and hence we can't make progress because it's culture. I don't, I'm an American. I don't know that Americans have a particularly admirable culture compared to India. On the other hand, I think what is important is not a generic culture, but an organizational culture. So there is an organizational culture that can inhibit success, but it's not a generic cultural feature that one needs to be, we can't do it. I have found that, I've lived and worked in India off and on for 30 years now, and I think culturally Indians are some of the most innovative and dynamic people I've ever been around. Just the spirit of, and I forget what the Indian word of God, right? Just making it work is an intrinsic part of a lot of Indian culture. So I think Indian culture generically has everything it takes to succeed. The question is, can that culture be brought inside the public sector, right? So I think, can you create a purpose-driven, problem-driven approach inside the culture of public sector organizations, not generically? And secondly, that does take leadership, but as part of PDIA, we emphasize that there's one vision of leadership, which is that the leader brings the solution. There's another vision of leadership in which the leader authorizes action and enables action. And we think the second model of leadership is a much more effective way of building from low capability to high capability. In fact, as part of our PDA book and work, one of my colleague, Matt Andrews, did a study where we looked at 30 different international developing country cases of success. And in only 2 of those cases was the success the result of a leader coming in with a solution that they knew in advance would work, implementing that solution as designed and having success. That was 2 of the 30 success cases. Nearly all the other cases of success were a leader framed a problem in a way that it authorized others to act, enabled them to have what they needed to, pursue problem-driven kind of practices that would lead to solutions, and then created the environment in which those solutions were adopted. And the solution was never anything like what you what you would have envisioned as the clean, well-designed solution to start with. So I agree so I do think we need a leadership-focused approach, and there does need to be powerful leadership, and that leadership is going to have to come from the people in this room. But when you in this room think of yourself as leaders, you want to think, how am I acting in a leader in a way that conveys a culture of problem-driven and purpose-driven action and enables those at the bottom level to act with agency in a way that unleashes their potential, and then also produces process compliance so that you don't get this eroded by rent seeking or malfeasance. So that kind of leadership, I think, is really important. But the imagination of leadership is that I am the leader and I have a big stick and I'm going to beat the turtle to move towards the goal. That model of leadership is just not going to work. It's not going to work.
Thank you, Professor. So we have our district magistrates. Some of them would like to share the challenges and some of the lessons that they have learned while applying this problem-driven iterative adaptation approach. So I would request Ramakrishna from South West Garo Hills district.
Good evening, Professor Pritchett. In a country like India, where actually the state is the welfare state and the public depend on most of the basic needs on the government, actually they form they are a part of the state. Instead of looking at state as the governance mechanism only, they also form a part of the state.
Right.
And there actually we have some difference in the shared purpose because of misinformation or religious beliefs or any other reason. Because now actually everyone wants to end COVID, but the thing is vaccination the most effective way? Some of the stakeholders are thinking that it is, and some of the stakeholders are thinking that it is not. And it is more of an attitude and something like accumulated beliefs over a period of time. So in such a situation, most of our iterations and adaptations, they did not achieve the results as we expected. Whereas in case of maternal and child health, we were able to see some good results. Whereas when it comes to vaccine hesitancy, in addressing this hesitancy part, even after we roped in religious institutions, NGOs, and all other stakeholders, especially in the core hesitancy areas, where actually this social reinforcement works, like all the households share a common belief and they reinforce each other.
Yeah.
How should the service provider proceed in such a situation?
I mean, there's a really deep and important point that goes beyond COVID here, and I'm not going to be able to suggest a solution as to how immediately to reduce resistance to this. Is again, my country has this problem, so this is not unique, and it's an unbelievably difficult problem. But let me start from when I say problem-driven, we need to be sure that there's an adequate understanding and agreement on what the problem is. Oftentimes, the problems that get nominated and the solution are nominated in an internal technocratic process without asking the question, is this really a problem that's being nominated by the citizens, by the politicians, and is there a sufficiently adequately shared vision of the problem? And the difficulty is that when the problem gets framed exclusively technocratically, you can run up in implementation against people who aren't convinced of the solution because they weren't actually brought on board early in understanding what the problem was to which the solution was tailored. I did this a number of years ago. I did a study of after Iran had kind of cut itself off from the rest of the world as part of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. In the 1980s, Iran implemented one of the most successful family planning programs that had ever been implemented in the history of man. They had the most rapid fall in rural fertility of any country ever through a really unbelievably massive and rapid expansion of family planning. Now, you might have thought, geez, like Islam had always been, in many Islamic countries, they've been resistant to Western-driven family planning programs. But when Iran went to do it, they did it with a shared understanding of a problem that Iran faced and a shared understanding of what the social and cultural resistances to the other typically top-down driven ways of doing family planning programs had been, and the reason why they created resistances. So they found a way to, in fact, work with the local religious leaders and work through the local, both religious and health leaders, to change completely the vision of what was an Islamically accepted view of family planning. So I'm just giving this example, not that it's directly relevant, but it's just an example that when we say problem-driven, part of the essence is creating the problem in a way that authorizes action. Often we, as technocrats, believe we know, and often we do know technical things about the world, but we can't create the problem necessarily, or we need to pay attention to creating the problem in a way that it's widely shared, that our vision of the problem is in fact a shared purpose. Because otherwise, you can start down technocratic and managerial and things that are completely, totally technically correct, but get hampered in implementation because you didn't take the time to build the problem. So often, now COVID is kind of an exception to every rule, and that's why I hate talking about COVID, because it's this unbelievably dire and unique thing. But often as we work on PDAA, what we want to do is slow down the problem definition stage, because people want to skip. Oh, no, we know what the problem is, and often they know what the problem is because they know what they think the solution is, and they have defined recursively back to the problem from the solution they have in mind. And by skipping the problem definition phase of creating the shared definition of the problem among all of the relevant shareholders, you then just get stuck immediately in implementation. This isn't, and again, I agree, this isn't completely at all solving your problem, but I just want to raise the more generic point that the problem definition stage means getting to a shared understanding of the problem with not just the internal organizational shareholders, but with the authorizers and the citizens. And I notice in the state capability approach of Meghalaya that you're using there, you have a kind of vision of citizen-state relationship as being a very important part of the overall process of building capability.
Thank you, Professor. So now I would like to request our Honorable Minister for Health, Mr. James Sangma is here. He has a question for you.
Good afternoon, Professor. Just wanted to say it's a great honor to be here and to get to know you. I just want to say your presentation has been so riveting and eye-opening. Thank you so much for this lovely presentation. After listening to you, it just appears that that we as a state and we as a nation, would you say, are already, as you would call it, in the capability trap? And would you say that? And secondly, I wanted to ask you that do you think it's time for governments and unique states like us, like Meghalaya, to hyper-localize our growth doctrine based not just on human capital, but also on natural capital?
I mean, two parts of the question. One, I definitely think significant parts of India are in a capability trap. But by the same token, one of the points I always make is that parts of India work really amazingly well. And India has had a lot to be proud of over the last 30 years. It's a night and day different place than what I came to in 1991. So again, I don't think parts of India are in capability traps, but I wouldn't let that lead to pessimism that the trap is inescapable. India is the world's largest democracy and holds free and fair elections at just a scale most other countries can only imagine. India, can send a rocket ship to Mars successfully. So there are certainly Indian pockets of success that have escaped the capability trap. The question is just how to change that trap dynamic to a progress dynamic, and I think it's possible. And then B, I think part of this is going to be, yes, a much more hyper-localized approach. I think the center-driven, scheme-driven approach is a remarkably successful approach to a very narrow and limited set of problems. And fortunately, many of the problems that can be adequately addressed by the scheme-driven approach have been addressed. Nearly every Indian child now goes to school, and that's a terrific accomplishment. So, yes, I've always been a big fan of what you call a hyper-local, which is let's unleash, state-specific dynamics. Let's unleash local dynamics within the states by, again, as the very first question started from, a strategic and tactical bottom-up approach of asking ourselves, how do we unleash our specific local capabilities, and how are we going to escape as a state, or as districts, or as blocks, or as villages? How are we going to unleash our own capabilities and build our own capabilities to establish locally accepted and locally implementable practices that are going to achieve and work us towards more capability? So yeah, I think part of the tension is, one of the hardest things for any organization to do is to make a transition away from a previously successful strategy. So if you have a successful strategy at expansion, and you need to move from expansion to quality, that's very difficult because the people in the organization are built around the previous practices. So only in some sense, you can't top down that necessary change. It has to be kind of emerge from a local approach. So I'm super supportive of unleashing the potential capability that exists in localities, in states, in the incipient leadership, to move beyond the kind of trap dynamics in which the fear of blame rather than the fear of failure is driving process compliance that keeps it at a low level, but from getting to a higher level.
Professor, thank you very much. So what we will, in fact, there are many people who are requesting for some questions. We will pose those questions later. But before that, before actually our Honorable Chief Minister would actually give his final remarks, we would like to show you what the Meghalaya, state, as a whole is trying to do, and what has been done. So we'll show you a few slides. So that would be helpful for everybody. So I think we will show the presentation. This is the kind of a way forward, as I mentioned, I began in the initial remarks. So what is the way forward for the Meghalaya state capability, based on our own experimentations? So we have been developing this state capability enhancement project as we attempt to apply the principles of state capability for development challenges in Meghalaya. And when we just some of the, when we started working, when we started investing in the decentralized leadership, local leadership, mobilizing these block level officials, village leadership, we can see the kind of a massive, in fact, results in terms of, uptake of the rural employment, in terms of the spending in the rural development sector, you can see there. And next. So again, this led to, a different kind of things, like people coming together and doing innovating, mobilizing. We can see that similarly, we've worked on the health sector, the same kind of using the PDI approach, involving different, departments together. So again, we could see when we worked on the systems, basically systemically, when we started working with a collaborative approach, we could see the kind of results that we have achieved. And this is again a very interesting case, when we have this nutrition is a major issue. When we started again working with a political leadership, draw the attention, there is an authorization that this needs to be actually addressed. There is an administrative leadership. So that all led to, you can see the kind of the recovery of this severely acute malnourished children, and also the moderately acute malnourished children. In 1 year, you could actually come from almost over 20,000 to now today it's about 1,100. So this is again now current work is that we are working again with the same approach, again collaborating with the different departments, the maternal deaths, because this is again an issue, a systemic issue. We cannot look at as a health problem. This has a gender problem, it's a poverty problem. So it's again working with that systems approach and using again a technology. We also in the process, we also actually started using, a technology kind of that led to again, we could see some initial results, gains of this intervention. Next. So based on this, in fact, these are the, the 6 pillars that we found based on our experimentation within state of Meghalaya. We found these 6 principles are, pillars are very important to build the state capability, or, to see that change that we wanted to see, building that local leadership, essentially, and also making sure that we are promoting that citizen state relationship, through that actually we handled the COVID, involving the communities, how actually we could, address some of the important adaptive challenges, effective use of data, and focusing on that accountability as well as promoting the agency and also really empowering the field functionaries to really experiment and, find solutions. And we are using a capability through practice approach, not through the training alone. So how actually people do experiment, learn, and iterate, and institutionalize that process. And we also actually working on the systems thinking. In fact, one example is that when we talk about the education, the learning abilities that what we talk about, generally we talk about like teachers training, but we are also thinking that maybe we can do even better. Can we think about the early childhood development period before they come to the school? How actually we can address that one. So though there is no, this is the kind of things that we are thinking. Next. So now the question is like, how do we expand and institutionalize the state capability model to tackle other complex development challenges of the state? Here actually we have come out with some kind of of course, these are the things that we require a great political leadership, strong political leadership, administrative capability, and again is we also have to, that will actually result into a greater human and economic development. So taking this, the importance of the political leadership and importance of the administrative capabilities, how do we the state leadership can identify and prioritize the areas for Meghalaya and define shared vision and goals. So we'll go to this one. Actually, I would like to show, this is here actually the authorization. As you said, the authorization is important for finding solutions and finding and building the leadership. And then thereafter assembling teams and engage stakeholders and using this problem-driven iterative adaptation process. And through that, we are learning, and these successes and are actually becoming institutionalized. Next. So that's where I would like to stop here. These are the kind of priority areas for the state capability. Just like there are many, but we flagged few things. But before I handing over, to our Honorable Chief Minister, who is the authorizer in this entire state capability initiative. So I would like to request our Honorable Chief Minister to give his remarks and share his vision for the state capability. Thank you.
Very good evening to everyone. My colleague in the cabinet, James Sangma, handling our health and forest portfolio, among others. Professor who has joined us, Professor Lant, who has joined us from Oxford, and all our other officials who are here right now, connected online as well as physically, and our officials from CPR who are very much responsible for making this happen. I won't take much time because I think we have heard a lot, but I cannot disagree with the professor in almost every point that he has said. In fact, I agree with almost all the areas that he has mentioned. And I'll just touch upon a few points that I strongly believe are very correct in the presentations that he had given. First of all, in 2018, when we took over the government, I was asked a question by the press and by the people, what is your top priority? And I told them my top priority is to improve the delivery mechanism, because we have a lot of money that comes in. We have a large number of schemes that come in, but somehow it does not reach the people on time. And somehow the implementation of these schemes also are not done to the level where it needs to be done. So therefore, my one-line answer at that point, and I still stick to that answer of mine, is that we need to improve the delivery mechanism at the grassroots level. Now, having said that, I believe there is no real perfect solution when it comes to running a government, because it's not like a corporation or not like a business house where rules can be followed. There is politics, there is social character, there is public issues, and you need to balance out all of it. So really, at the end of the day, it's really balancing things is what's important. So you need to keep an agenda in mind. You need to ensure that these are the areas that you're focusing on. You have health sector, you have infrastructure, the social sectors, the economic sectors. But while you do all of this, you are in the middle of this entire ecosystem with just unpredictable things happening, and somehow we have to manage and juggle all of it together. And that's really what the challenge is. But without getting into those aspects, I would like to, again, as I said, touch on one or two points that are mentioned earlier by Professor. Number one is that I have always been a very firm believer of purpose-driven and a problem-driven process to move forward. Simply because if there is no purpose, then the passion and the motivation does not come, whether it's in the leadership or whether it's in the officials. And I think leadership's quality, or one of the most important tasks, is to instill that sense of purpose among the team members, to give the direction as to what is it that we want to achieve. And obviously in the process, when we try to achieve that, identification of the problems is very critical. And I was reading one very successful CEO, he was one of the CEOs from one of the Indian companies. And he said, and somebody had asked him, what is your leadership mantra? So he said, it's very simple. I just find good people and I allow them to do whatever they want. So that's really a very, very powerful mantra. I believe in that myself. And because sometimes you know what the problem is, you know where you want to get, but you don't have the time nor the capacity to, at the end of the day, figure out the solution to every problem. And so therefore, for me also, I've been very clear. I would like my team to be able to, number one, be very motivated, to be very clear about the purpose and the vision that we have, to be able to identify our goals in a very systematic manner, time-bound manner, and then allow them to do what they have to do to find the solution to it. All I ask my team, you can ask my team, and when you speak to them and when you engage with them later on, I just tell them, I don't know what you will do. I don't know how you will do it. All I know is that I want this particular target to be completed by this particular date. So I strongly subscribe to this, definition of leadership which you've mentioned, is that it's not about really coming in with the solution yourself. Really, you have limited capacity. As a leader, you need to look at the overall picture, but then you need to empower your team, especially the team members who are motivated. And this is where we have started a lot of things. For example, when I started off trying to move forward, I was struggling to find people who would be motivated. Seriously, I was struggling to find people who had this sense of purpose. And so I started off with entrepreneurs. So I know that there are entrepreneurs who want to do things. And somehow nobody seems to touch them. Nobody seems to recognize them. Nobody seems to give them any support. And so I realized that entrepreneurs may be one of the most motivated, most dynamic, most purpose-driven individuals. So we started with entrepreneurs. We started recognizing them. We started coming up with specific programs where we started having business plan competitions. And it's not just about the fact that you will actually see the economy being impacted in terms of job opportunities coming up and other economic benefits you get, but you will actually see a sense, or and I'll have to use the word culture, but this culture of motivation, culture of purpose coming in. And entrepreneurs can really, really be, very strong idols for so many individuals. And so therefore we started off with them. And even today, I would say Meghalaya has one of the better entrepreneurial programs, and we still are focusing on the entrepreneurs of our state, because we feel that they could be shining examples of individuals who are highly motivated, purpose-driven, risk-takers, individuals who will fight even in the most difficult situations. And that's the kind of capacity and culture that we would like to have in our system. But Professor, I would like to not say I disagree, because I don't like to disagree, but I would like to say that after my little experience I've had in administration, I want to stress that there is no right way to do things in the long run. There are different factors that are there, different ways of doing things. So having a purpose and capacity building obviously is overarching aspect of overall governance, but at times we need to learn from others. So I will not simply say that best practices are not good things, or we should not, but I would just say that we need to adapt it to our needs. So therefore, there is a good practice. Let's see what is the best part of it. Take it. What is not useful to us, leave it behind. So we need to have best practices, adaptive best practices need to be brought in. We need to have processes. Our government system is so complicated. If you don't have processes and you leave it to individual, there will be chaos. So we need standard operating procedures in the system. We need processes. We need continuous monitoring that has to be there. But while we do all of this, obviously, the overarching aspect is that the team needs to be more. And I have been talking about this a lot to my team now. It's another theory or whatever you call it that has come into my mind, that has been really playing around in my mind, is that we have a lot of departments doing a lot of things. And, and sometimes the purpose is the same, but everybody is doing different programs, different schemes, spending double, triple money. So I have come up with this, point when I'm, and again, just trying to analyze the whole thing. So I was, in fact, in the morning, I was talking about it, that it's like creating noise. So what happens is that if one department does something, it's like, one noise is created. Then a second department does something, again, a noise is created. Third department does something, another noise is created. So when you listen to all of these things, it's like a large hodgepodge noise going on. But if you're actually able to synchronize the work that they're doing, if you're able to synchronize the noises that are being made, this noise is then converted into music. So how can we convert noise into music is another point that I strongly feel we need to focus on when we go for this capability building. Now, when so much is happening, somebody needs to coordinate it, put the efforts together, as I said, create music out of the noise that is there. And a lot of noise is there, a lot of things are happening. It's just a question of rearranging things, connecting one dot to another dot, connecting one program to another program. And that's another part, because what happens is when you're able to do that, you will be able to get more out of the efforts being put in at the end of the day. So this is another aspect which I would want the team to really focus on. I don't want to go into, I was told to talk about the state's vision. I mean, I can go on and on and on about being number one in this, number two in this, trying to get up these numbers. Those are just numbers. At the end of the day, there is a systematic problem in the system, as was mentioned by Professor. We need to look inside where we are, where the problems are. My biggest frustration only is that it's such a big system. And my frustration is that we just don't know how long this process of trying to bring in this capability and this sense of purpose will take. But I'm happy to see that the system, the process has started responding. I'm happy to see that it's happening. We're actually seeing things moving. And maybe the biggest advantage we as a state have is that we are actually a number that is manageable. Now, you look at a state like Uttar Pradesh, and I've got 10 plus crore population. It's 100 million people. I mean, even if one wants to start, I don't know where they will start and where they will end. I'm not trying to, be negative about them. But I think the biggest advantage we have is we have a state that is manageable, that has got a population about 3.8 million, which we can actually make a difference in. More importantly, we have institutional setups and systems that are actually working right now. We have empowered them to a large extent. We're actually seeing the numbers now coming up, like you saw in immunization. We were at the bottom of the chart, Professor. We were at the bottom of the chart 3 years back. And today we are at the top of the chart. You see? Our numbers and our expenditures in many of the Government of India schemes have tripled in the last year, even during COVID. Reflecting that the system is actually responding to the kind of push motivation we're doing. So therefore, when I say SOPs are important, processes are important, it is because of the continuous monitoring. My team monitors certain things every week. I feel bad for the deputy commissioners because they are every Tuesday they have to come, every Wednesday they are on video conferencing. But then there is clear results. We are actually seeing the difference. So to conclude, I don't think there is any perfect solution or perfect mechanism that one can put on the table and say, well, this is the answer. I mean, for academic purpose, we could discuss it. There's no problem. But when it comes to practical, everything will have to be based on the situation you face. Everything will be based on the different dynamics that you're facing, the challenges. And every step you take will depend on what particular issue is more important at the point in time. I mean, it could be they're going to face elections the next year. So obviously, when you're facing elections the next year, then there are certain issues that come to your mind as a policymaker, a decision maker. It's something that's common to all governments, not just me. So all of these factors will be there. But yes, when you look at the overall aspect, the processes, the purpose, the passion that you talked about, these are very, very crucial. You need to have that core. Otherwise, you're not going anywhere. No matter what policy you have, no matter what schemes you have, none of this is going to make any difference if the sense of purpose is not there. And I have been, speaking about my purpose, and I would like to end my my talk with or my views with just this one line. I tell people that if somebody asks me what is my purpose, so my purpose is to be able to make a difference in every individual's life that we touch. A positive difference. So that is my purpose. With that purpose, I work. So that purpose helps me to work in even very difficult conditions. I'll just give you an example. Day before yesterday, I was traveling back from Shillong after finishing a number of political meetings back to my constituency. And I reached at about 11, 12 o'clock in the night. I was very tired. But suddenly I saw this old man. He had no shoes. He was wearing a shirt that was so worn out, and most probably hadn't had food also. And he was waiting for me, and I just couldn't help myself. So I just went and I spoke to him, because I thought that even if I can sit for 5 minutes with him and listen to what he has to say, I have enough power to be able to make a difference in his life. And if that purpose is not there in my mind, then I think my tiredness would have got over me. And I would have just gone into my room. So it's so important, as you said, that one has to have that sense of purpose, because it allows you to push yourself and go beyond even certain limitations, physical, mental, and be able to really do what you want to do. So I think I'm very much with you in that, Professor. I managed to make a difference. He wanted a low-cost house. So I worked with some people. I got the low-cost house worked out for him. And we are able to help people, individuals like that. So to conclude, thank you so much. I must say the Meghalaya State Capability Forum, I'm sure, is going to be something which is going to be really, really great. But I must tell you that you also must have a sense of purpose. And number two, you must have a time-bound manner in which you're going to do it. Have set goals that you're going to think. And I would be happy to see if you can work out specific programs that you're going to work on. So going generalized way is not going to be able to quantify the kind of results that you will get. If you can come out with a specific area, maybe a specific program, maybe a specific problem that we have, and actually work and show on how the capability aspect has made a difference in that particular problem, then I think it'll be easier to sell this and motivate others to also be part of this. So therefore, to conclude, no perfect solution, but we need to mix and match. And in governance, things are always very complicated. But yes, these are areas that can help us resolve a lot of problems. I once again thank the Center for Policy Research. And once again, I would like to thank Professor Lant for his time. And I'm sure the other participants are also very keen to ask him many questions. I hope that we'll get another chance to be together and discuss more on this, as this is definitely an area of great interest to me. So, Professor, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for your inputs. And I wish this forum and all of you the very best. Thank you very much.
Thank you, our Honorable Chief Minister, for his sharing his valuable reflections and his inspiring words. So, I think from the CPR side, any questions you would like to ask either Yaminiji or Meghalaya?
Well, Lant, we've discussed many of these issues oftentimes, but I'm going to ask you a question nonetheless, which is, well, two questions actually. One, one of the challenges with purpose is that we often institutions work towards purpose, but there are limits, but the definitions of purpose itself need to be challenged. So how does one build platforms to be able to iterate around purpose itself? And I think that links to my second question, which is that very often within government, the target becomes the purpose, and we look to find ways. So we've talked about process and targets, but often the best way to achieve the target is to bypass the state itself. So we do, there is this big push towards cash transfers in our debates on welfare across the country, across the globe. We talk about it in the form of UBI, but I think it's a slightly different debate here. We emphasize cash because it's a way of getting around all the flaws within the system to meet your target. So if my purpose is that I need to deliver X to a beneficiary, I will just try and bypass the entire process to get there, and I limit it to that. Now, how does bypassing impact these debates around purpose, role, and normative goals and responsibilities of the state?
Let me start from kind of maybe a negative view and work back. I worry that the cash transfer kind of movement has displaced a really legitimate conversation about the purpose and role of the state. In the sense that there are things that the state needs to do that simply can't be displaced by cash. So, rule of law, a police force, an education system. And moreover, even where one can imagine individuals using their own cash to solve problems, as is in some components, people rely enormously on the private sector healthcare. The regulatory function of the state, I think, is still super important. So I worry that the state of India cannot just simply say, we can't provide you an uncorrupt and, decent police force. We can't provide you with decent education. We can't provide regulations that even create a thriving environment for an efficacious health sector in either the public or private sector. But instead, here's some cash. That just isn't, I think, that's not the way to development that any other state has ever pursued. Every other state has ultimately dealt with the core questions of state capability. B, I think the cash puts tools in the service of a really narrow logistical objective. And hence, it makes tech look more important. It makes, design look more important than it really is. So you displace a whole bunch of core purposive functions that require implementation intensity with something that is, in fact, a logistical process. And then you declare success by having reduced the problem to logistics. So I think one of the nice things that's emerged in coming here is, coping with maternal mortality, coping with climate change, coping with the other challenges of education raised isn't going to be solved just through cash. So I've got no kind of deep objection to taking poorly performing in-kind transfers and transforming them into more effective cash transfers. All for that. But let's acknowledge that's 2% of the state capability agenda, not 98% of the state capability. And let's keep in mind, core purposes of the state that really need to be improved and enhanced. And many of those are going to be implementation intensive when we move forward. The second thing is, it's a great question of how do you challenge purpose, because one of the ways in which, organizations end up at donuts is they end up too committed to a purpose that becomes irrelevant. And hence, in the education sector, for instance, getting every kid in school was an important purpose. No one should object to that. But the longer they stayed on the exclusive focus on schooling the harder it became to shift to a new and more expansive vision of, every child in school and learning. And so this way of challenging purpose is really important, and I just don't have a good answer to it. Because, to some extent, if you narrow the conversation around just the organization, you can get into an echo chamber around purpose that, isn't open to what the rest of society and what the current circumstances are demanding. So, but how to do that? Let me just make, with respect to that though, I think one interesting point that I think Devesh Kapoor and Pratap Banu Mehta made about capability in India is, and this came up in the Chief Minister's remarks, is that there are many organizations doing the same thing. I think one of the things that happens is once an organization becomes a donut, rather than try and fix it, you just create a new organization that actually has the same purpose that you were originally intended for the previous organization. And then, as Devesh points out, these organizations often go through a life cycle of, at their creation, they're purpose-driven, and then they start to decline, and then you create a new one. So I do think if organizations had ways of re-challenging their purpose and remaking themselves, that would avoid this duplication process. And at some stage, you have to reconsolidate the organizations that were all created with the same purpose, and that's going to be a difficult thing. So I don't really have a good answer to this challenge of purpose question. And to some extent, that is a role that politicians play. Inside organizations, there tends to be an insular view. And, dynamic and visionary politicians are often the ones that come along and go, hey, you guys, you're not in touch with what we really need here. And that's this.
Thank you, Professor. I think we have Secretary Education would like to ask a question. Yeah.
I have one very small question for Professor Lant, that in your research paper document, The Rebirth of Education, you have mentioned schooling is not learning. Now, I would like to get some tips from you. How does one go about building a strong education system?
That's hardly a 3-minute question. I think the answer is, if we really want to talk about that, I'm happy to set up a forum to talk with that. But let me start with, I think one of the challenges, and if I had to start with how I would really rebuilding an effective education system, I would have exactly the kind of conversation that Yamini suggests about what really is the purpose. Because in many ways, the education system has always defined itself as a selection system, not an education system. It doesn't start from the premise that the purpose of education is to equip every child. It starts from the premise that the purpose of the education system is to identify those few children who are capable of an education and push those forward. So I think if I were a minister of education and I really wanted to really enhance the effectiveness of the system of education, I would start with the question of purpose and start with the discussion of, have we gone on too long with a selection system that says our purpose is to identify those few children that are capable of achieving high performance and push those forward, and devil take the hindermost. The teaching to the front of the class, the assumption that many kids can't learn, I think those are deeply embedded in the kind of ideas inside the Indian education system. And until one addresses those questions head on in terms of purpose, I think you're going to have a hard time because people are acting with conflicted purposes. And Yamini is coming out very soon with a great book about how the purpose conflict is at the center of education reform. And I'm putting pressure on her because it's a book that's been coming out and it's great. So I think if I were you, I would start with, are we really of one mind about what we can achieve? And there is no reason why India can't achieve an environment in which every child learns. But to do so, you have to remake and re-clarify that that is in fact the purpose. The purpose of the system isn't to select the elite. The purpose is to equip everyone. And then at some stage, there's some future selection. And I would start with that. I'm in charge of this like $5 million research project on why Vietnam is so successful. And the answer they keep giving me is because they want it to be. And it might seem dumb and it might seem to have been really expensive to hire a bunch of brainiacs to come up with that answer, but it's important because to the extent that you give yourself technocratic answers, you're wrong. The answer is, do you really want it? Thank you very much. Let me quit there. I'm afraid I have to run. I've been very honored to be at this forum and very informed. It's super enthusiastic to me to see the enthusiasm and interest in this topic, and I hope this forum becomes a big success.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much. And I also thank our co-host, Yamini ji from the CPR. And also, I would like to thank our Honorable Minister who stayed back, our Health Minister, Mr. James Sangma, and listening to you. And we are very happy, and really, it's something that what you have taught us today, how to really work on building the state capability to really address very important problems, that are need to be addressed, to make a progress. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.